The Last Room on the Left, by Ronald Bradshaw, front matter, to the brave souls who venture down forgotten roads, seeking shelter from the storms of life, only to find themselves at the doorstep of something far older and more terrifying than the tempest outside.